Hey guys, welcome to part one of the recorded lectures for chapter 25, The Global Crisis, 1921 to 1941. So this is kind of the chapter that covers how do we get America into World War II. We'll start right now. All right, so these are the main breakdowns of the chapter. We're going to talk about foreign policy and diplomacy, the struggles between isolationism, which was what most Americans believed in prior to us getting involved in World War II, and the internationalist view really advocated by FDR. And then ultimately the abandonment of neutrality and direct intervention. Okay, so in the 1920s, the United States was engaged in foreign policy in an effort to reduce the likelihood of war. That doesn't mean that we ratified the Treaty of Versailles, which we covered in a previous unit. If we remember, that was rejected because of a sense that America would be surrendering too much of its own sovereignty by joining the League and being committed to foreign conflicts. It's part of Article X, if you can remember. In 1921, the United States helped negotiate and agree to something known as the Washington Conference of 1921. It was basically an agreement meant to limit an arms race in navies, large battleships like that. The agreement, again negotiated in the United States, set up a ratio, 5-5-3-1. And basically, 5 and 5 belonged to the nations that asserted they had the right to create the largest and maintain the largest and most powerful navies in the world. That was England and the United States, which makes sense because we're hosting the negotiations here. 3, that country was Japan, and 1 was Italy and France. Now, the big takeaway of this is, again, this seemingly general commitment in the 1920s to limit the possibility of outbreak of a major war because of naval engagements, aggression. But the fact that Japan was able to earn a second-tier spot at the conference from the United States and England, right, two foreign powers that had possessions and interests in the Pacific, Japan's sort of field of dominance from its perspective, is very significant. It demonstrates that Japan is obtaining some of the respect it has desired for itself for so long after beginning industrialization and following its sort of shocking success, at least for the non-Asian powers of the world, in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. And so 1 was Italy and France. So again, the ratio for every massive battleship, right, Italy and France produced, Japan could make 3 of those, and England and the United States could make 5. And so this was supposed to kind of, again, sort of maintain the status quo of naval dominance throughout the world, and therefore avoid the outbreak of war. In 1928, there was another agreement that was signed by the United States known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and this is a photograph on the slide of America signing it. It's a beautiful thing, but ultimately not practical. Basically, 14 nations, with the United States being one of them, signing this pact agree to outlaw war as a measure of policy. So not to commit violence against neighbors in pursuit of resources or additional territory or anything like that. Again, the biggest weakness of the Kellogg-Briand Pact is it is essentially a nice verbal commitment. There's no means of enforcement. And sadly, will not be enough to stop the violence that's coming. Debts and diplomacy. So outside of a commitment to disarmament and an agreement that war is bad, the United States foreign policy was also focused on finance. We talked about this. In the 1920s, we set up a system of debt called the Dawes Plan. And this is, again, referred to as that circular loan image I sent you, or had you write down. The idea is that it's going to enable the European powers who were devastated by World War I to pay back their debt to the United States, who had lent them an insane amount of money during the First World War. And as they were rebuilding in the 20s and 30s, they should be able to pay it back over time. The problem is it is a cycle of debt. Again, America would infuse money into Germany following the end of World War I. They would use some of it for rebuilding, most of it for reparations as a result of the Treaty of Versailles to England, France, and Italy, and they were supposed to repay their wartime debt to the United States from World War One. The only way the Dawes Plan works long term is that those countries actually recover, prosper, and grow their economies, and then the debt gets more easy to pay off over time. That ultimately doesn't work. We benefit in the 20s, and Europe slowly starts to recover, but not anywhere near to pay off the entire debt. And by the 30s, as we know, we hit the Great Depression, and it makes the whole thing not viable. Another thing in the 20s that we see from the United States is that more and more of our corporations are finding commercial interests in countries within Latin America. We had discussed that this was a process that had occurred really as far back as President Roosevelt's, Teddy Roosevelt, term in office. Again, the idea of the Roosevelt Corollary, an expansion of the Monroe Doctrine, the push by Teddy to get the Panama Canal for American commercial and strategic security interests, as well as President Taft's views of dollar diplomacy in Nicaragua, and Woodrow Wilson's view that everyone should listen to America and do as we say, essentially, with his interventions in the Dominican Republic and Cuba and other parts of Latin America. The big thing is that by the 20s, this sort of legacy of Yankee imperialism has been causing problems, but it also means that Latin American countries are more economically reliant on the United States because of the dominance of our corporations in their economies. That will also be tied to the Depression once it hits in the 30s. Okay, when do things start getting bad on the world stage? In the 20s, it already starts. We tend to overlook that because, again, we're focused on the Roaring 20s and how good things relatively were here. In 1922, Italy essentially surrenders power or gives power to a dynamic figure named Benito Mussolini. He is the first world leader to sort of articulate the view of fascism, which is basically militant nationalism to an extreme level. I'm going to get more into the ideology of fascism in a bit, but he's the first sort of fascist dictator. And him and his black shirts promoting Italian nationalism, militarism, the best way to kind of govern the country and promote efficiency and promote Italian greatness. And they're going back to ancient Rome and a lot of their rhetoric and policies and views and all that stuff. They march on Rome in 1922. His black shirts, that was his fascist followers, and they're given power. And in 1923, a young Adolf Hitler, leading his own German nationalist group, the Nazis, decided that he was going to try to, march on Berlin, essentially, and seize power. That march didn't go so well. Adolf Hitler's small group of early Nazi followers and ideologues were broken up by the police. Several were killed. Hitler himself was arrested and sent to prison for a short time. He got off pretty light. And in that brief stint in prison, Hitler was able to have his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, written, which kind of became one of the key books of Nazi Germany once he achieved power later. So Adolf Hitler, after leaving prison in the 20s, works to kind of expand this radical nationalist party, right? The German Nazi Party, National Socialist Workers' Party. And by 1933, it seems to have worked. The big thing is that Germany is not very stable. The Weimar Republic is promoting some recovery, but Germans are not used to a parliamentary system that's very fragmented, that requires a lot of coalitions. A lot of Germans are reeling from the effects of World War I, with the loss of 2 million soldiers, right, in that war, the huge drain on the economy. Germans are still very bitter about being told that despite all that sacrifice, they were to blame entirely for the war, and their economy was limping along, right, struggling to kind of renew itself throughout the 20s. Also in Germany, you do have the rise of radical factions. With the rise of the Nazis on the far right, you also have the rise of communists on the far left. And so it is a tumultuous period in German history, this period known as the Weimar Republic. I've included a brief video on the History Channel that kind of summarizes Hitler's rise to power, which I would encourage you guys to watch. It's not very long, it's about 3 to 5 minutes, but it's very good. So in 1922, Mussolini's in power in Italy, and in 1933, Hitler's in power. He is made chancellor. Now, That means that Hitler didn't seize power. Hitler was given that position. Now, he uses an emergency, the burning of the Reichstag, to expand that power into becoming a dictator. But by 1933, the end of that year, Hitler is in control of Germany. That's undisputed. And again, remember, Hitler's sort of rise to power coincides with FDR winning the election in 32 and then getting inaugurated in 33. And so in the 30s, these leaders, Mussolini, Hitler, FDR, they're focused on the Depression because it's affected all their countries. Their approaches to it differ somewhat, which we'll get to more. What's happening in Japan in the 30s? Japan wasn't as negatively impacted by World War I as with the European powers. But its views is that ultimately it needs to become an imperial power. And the big thing to remember is that there is an emperor of Japan, right, Hirohito. That's the guy we focus on usually for this unit. But the people in control of his government by the 30s are the military, right, the army and the navy essentially. And it's the military that has real ambition to not just expand their forces and have better ships and weapons and planes and bombs and all that, but also to expand Japan's empire. So Japan, by the way, has a very funny name for their empire. They call it the Sphere of Co-Prosperity in East Asia or something like that. But in 1931, Japan is on the move. Manchuria, this is a northern region of China. And it's rich in coal, which is a vital resource for any industrial economy at this time. And it had already been partitioned to some degree between Japan and China. But in the 30s, China is undergoing a civil war between the nationalists who controlled the government at the time and the communists, which are starting to rise and rallying around a central figure known as Mao Zedong, which you've all heard of before last year. So in 1931, there is an outbreak of violence between Japanese and Chinese forces in Manchuria, and Japan ultimately seizes the territory for Japan. This is a clear violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, right, and other agreements, right, nations like Japan had made in years past. Basically, Henry Stimson, refuses to acknowledge any sort of shift in territorial ownership based on violence or aggression. We could call this the Stimson Doctrine. So all Henry Stimson of the United States can say, as Secretary of State at the time under Hoover, is that we don't recognize, right, the new ownership of Manchuria, basically saying we don't permit, right, what you have done to the Chinese people by seizing their territory. It doesn't stop it. It doesn't force Japan to return it. It's pretty much a condemnation of what Japan had done. By 1937, the Japanese military has made it clear that they're ready to invade and take all of China, essentially along the coast, but all of southern China as well. And they begin the invasion in 1937 in the summer. It is quick, it is brutal, it is violent, and it demonstrates ultimately the scale of violence that the League of Nations is totally ineffective. It's not going to stop any major large-scale violence or war. All right, here are some very disturbing photographs of the invasion of China in 1937. As you can see here is a tragic image of a baby in a bombed-out area of Shanghai, a coastal city of China, in August of 1937. And a big thing to remember is that World War II is so horrific, not just for the duration of the conflict. I mean, you could argue that the war had started in Asia long before it did in Europe, but also the civilian casualties. This, for example, is one photograph of the Nanjing or Nanking massacre of 1937, where civilians were really targeted and horrifically and brutally murdered, tortured, and so forth by Japanese military forces in China. And to this day, the Chinese government has not forgotten this, and there's still a lot of hard feelings between the two nations, Japan and China, over the legacies of World War II. Okay, we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up with a discussion over ideology.